Jesus is crucified. Let's take a look. Welcome back. Today we continue our study in Luke chapter 23 as Jesus has now been sentenced to death and is crucified. Let's take a look in verse 26. When they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, coming in from the country, and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. During the trials over the previous 12 hours, Jesus had been beaten and scourged relentlessly at the hands of the Romans. Roman flogging is known to have been especially brutal, as the individual would be violently whipped until they were on the very brink of death. All of this would have left the body of Jesus, even prior to the crucifixion, in a severely weakened state. As part of the crucifixion process, the individual being crucified was forced to carry the instrument of their execution to the place where the act would be carried out. And Jesus was no exception, though, as it seems, he had been weakened to such a point that he was unable to proceed. This prompted the Romans to seize a nearby onlooker, one Simon of Cyrene, to carry Jesus' cross at least some of the distance. While not much is known about Simon himself, piecing together some of the other references throughout the scriptures, it leads us to the possibility that this one who literally carried the cross may have eventually had children who were involved in leading the early church. Mark's account in chapter 15, it explicitly records the names of two of Simon's children, Alexander and Rufus. First, much as mentioned with Malchus in our prior studies, the gospel writers often included the names of individuals because they would be familiar to the readers, such as if they were involved with the early church. Second, in the 16th chapter of the book of Romans, we also see Paul urging the recipients of his letter to greet Rufus. All in all, whether this case was to be proven or not, Simon of Cyrene, who was most likely in Jerusalem to observe the Passover, would now carry the cross of the Passover lamb. Verse 27. And following him was a large crowd of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Just as there had been for much of his ministry, even now a large crowd of people followed after Jesus, some mourning and undoubtedly some mocking, some lamenting and undoubtedly some were cheering. In the midst of all the chaos, Jesus delivers one of his final discourses to some of those who are present and distraught over the events that were taking place, urging them not to mourn for him, but to instead mourn what they would soon befall in Jerusalem. Even in the midst of the agony that he was enduring, he looked ahead sorrowfully to the fall of Jerusalem and considered that those who experienced the turmoil of that time would, contrary to the common view in their culture, bless the barren who had never had children. The turmoil of that time would be so great that individuals would call upon the mountains and hills to crush them. In a broader sense, he urged them not to weep for him, but for those who already had, and for those who still would, even in the future, reject him. From his perspective, his physical suffering, it was finite, but its effects would impact all of eternity. Verse 32. Two others also, who were criminals, were being led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. Now they arrive at the place called the Skull, otherwise known as Golgotha. While the exact location of such a place appears to have been lost in time, a few locations have been proposed, such as a hill outside of Jerusalem near the Damascus Gate that has a rock formation bearing the likeness of a skull. Another example is the location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In any case, rather than a remote location, it would have been close to an active road. Part of the Romans' goal with crucifixion, it was to make as much of an example out of their victims as possible, all in an attempt to intimidate onlookers. Crucifixion, it was a death known during that day as particularly shameful. Typically, it was reserved for the worst criminals, of which Jesus was now being numbered, even in his innocence. More so than shameful, crucifixion was excruciatingly painful. After the victim was scourged, tearing into their body repeatedly, and then being made to carry the crossbeam, they were then hung upon the cross. Nails were driven through their feet and their wrists, the latter of which would sever the median nerve, sending shooting, agonizing pain through the victim's arms. They were then suspended vertically in a posture which inhibited the ability to breathe naturally, forcing them to press with their pierced feet and to pull up with their pierced wrists in order just to gasp for air. Meanwhile, this very act, even just trying to breathe, it would scrape the raw wounds on their back against the rough wood of the cross. We have a tendency in our modern lens to romanticize the crucifixion. However, it was an ugly, agonizing, shameful death, and Jesus chose to endure it willingly on our behalf. Verse 34. But Jesus was saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves. In the midst of this great turmoil, Jesus continued to serve as an example for us. Over the course of the last 12 hours, he had just been betrayed by his friend, abandoned by his followers, rejected by his people, scourged, and now crucified by the Romans. Yet rather than crying out, requesting that the Father meet the actions of the individuals present with swift retribution, he cried out for them to be shown mercy, calling for their forgiveness because they did not know what they were doing. The statement, "they do not know what they are doing," it proved to be true in more ways than one. While they believed that what they were doing was ending the life of a criminal, they were actually causing the suffering of their Savior. Moreover, they didn't realize it, but all the while, even in their act of gambling for the clothes of this dying man, dividing his garment among them, they were also fulfilling prophecy. One such example of this can be seen in Psalms chapter 22, verses 14 through 18. "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And you lay me in the dust of death, for dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Even in the heinous act that's being committed, God was able to use it for his purposes and for his glory. Verse 35. "And the people stood by looking on, and even the rulers were sneering at him, saying, 'He saved others. Let him save himself if this is the Christ of God, his chosen one.' The soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him, offering him sour wine and saying, 'If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself.' Now there was also an inscription above him, 'This is the King of the Jews.'" Despite their mocking intent, the rulers, sneering, inadvertently admitted something. Just as they pointed out, Jesus had saved others. It was well within his power and ability to come down from the cross, in some sense, to release himself from the anguish and to prove his identity to the spectators once and for all. Yet, contrary to the ruler's accusations that saving himself would prove him to be the Christ of God, his chosen one, the truth is that remaining on the cross, fulfilling the role of a suffering servant, dying in our place, that is what proved it. Even the Roman soldiers present mocked him as well, declaring that if he truly was the King of Jews, as he had claimed to be and as was indicated by the inscription hung above him, he should save himself. This suggestion may or may not have been mockingly that he should display some great power or miracle to save himself, or again, mockingly, even a suggestion that he could order the Jews present to rise up and free him from his current torture. In any case, Jesus' goal wasn't to save himself. It was to save us. Verse 39. One of the criminals who was hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? save yourself and us." Not only were the rulers and Roman soldiers mocking him, but one of the criminals as well hurled abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." In some ways, this seemed to be reminiscent of Jesus' being tested in the wilderness as the enemy came to him in accusation, tempting him to prove his being the Son of God by working a miracle to save himself. This perhaps makes the specifics of this criminal's mocking even more fascinating. Save yourself and us. Jesus' goal then, just as it is now at the crucifixion, it wasn't to save himself, but rather to save us. Rather than working some great miracle, commanding the armies of heaven to come to his aid, he continued in obedience to accomplish the mission that he had been given. Verse 40. But the other answered and rebuking him said, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he was saying, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." In contrast to the mocking criminal, Luke records as the other is repentant. Some debate has been raised as the gospel accounts recorded by Matthew and Mark indicate that both criminals were mocking Jesus. While on the surface this seems to be some form of a contradiction, the answer is perhaps fairly simple to consider. This criminal began by mocking Jesus, but through observing his example, even in the face of being crucified, he had come to a belief in that moment. A belief that he was being crucified alongside the very Messiah himself, the Son of God. In this moment, the man in many ways understood and accepted the gospel. He realized that he was guilty. He realized that he was condemned. And last but not least, realizing that Jesus was innocent, he trusted in him. As many of us have read and heard the accounts of Jesus' death numerous times, it may be a detail easily overlooked, but it was important for Jesus to respond to the man and to give him the assurance that he needed. Important enough, in fact, that Jesus, in order to even speak, he would have had to have once again pulled himself up by his hands and feet in order to simply breathe and to tell the man, "Truly, I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." Verse 44. It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, because the sun was obscured, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. Now, in the final hours before Jesus' death, from the 6th hour to the 9th, or 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock p.m., even creation begins to react as its creator dies. Fascinatingly, some secular Roman historians, such as Pelagian, are quoted as recording such an event as the sky darkening and evening the accompanying earthquake included in the Gospel of Matthew. All of it within, as he records it, the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, AD 33, the same historical time frame as Jesus' death. Luke also recorded as the veil in the temple was torn in two. Historically speaking, the veil in the temple, it was essentially a large, thick curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. It was considered to be the place where God dwelt and met with men, where priests would come into the very presence of God and offer sacrifices on behalf of the people of Israel. Prior to doing so, these priests would undergo meticulous ritual cleansings, of which, if they failed to do any or to do them properly, they would be struck dead upon entry into the Holy of Holies. Now, however, the veil was torn. Through Jesus' death on the cross, the penalty of our sin was paid. The sin which had until this point served as an impassable barrier between us and the Father was no longer impassable. The way was made open so that not just the priests, but anyone could come into the presence of God by faith in the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. Verse 46. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. While on the surface, this cry to the Father could appear to be one of defeat, instead, it was truly a cry of victory. The mission for which he had come was accomplished, and he had conquered the great totality of all of our sin. Jesus breathed his last, not as though his life was taken from him, but as he, in demonstration of his power over death, yielded his spirit into the hands of the Father. Even his death, in it, he showed himself to be the source of life. Verse 47. Now, when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all the crowds who came together for the spectacle, when they observed what had happened, began to return, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who accompanied him from Galilee were standing at a distance, seeing these things. In witnessing Jesus' death, the nearby centurion is moved to a realization of the truth. Undoubtedly, he had experienced and most likely even been involved in many crucifixions before. Yet Jesus stood apart from the rest. The realization of the truth of Jesus' innocence moved even this Roman centurion, as it states in the text, to begin praising God. Meanwhile, the crowds, acquaintances, and the women who had accompanied him, all who had observed what happened, began to mourn. Some of them who were those who had been Jesus' followers. Undoubtedly, many others were among the crowd who had been crying out for his crucifixion. Some would have even been those who had mocked and slandered him. Yet after witnessing the events of his death, they were all brought to a place of mourning. Verse 50. And a man named Joseph, who was a member of the council, a good and righteous man, he had not consented to their plan and action, a man from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and he took it down and wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid him in a tomb cut into the rock where no one had ever lain. It was the preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. While the Roman practice was more common that after crucifixion, the body would be left on the cross, even for days, Joseph of Arimathea, and as recorded in the Gospel of John, even Nicodemus as well, came and requested of Pilate that they might be able to take the body and arrange a more proper burial. With permission granted, they took the body down, wrapped it, and laid him in a tomb where no one had ever lain. As mentioned in our study of John's account of Jesus' burial, this was perhaps more significant than it might seem even on the surface. To come into contact with a dead body would render the individual ceremonially unclean. Yet Joseph's and Nicodemus' love for Jesus, it was such that they were willing to do so even as the Passover, as well as the Sabbath, were about to begin. They were both members of the Sanhedrin, and one could easily imagine that being unable to participate in the normal ritual practices would draw attention to themselves. Yet it was of utmost importance to them for Jesus to have a more proper burial. Verse 55. Now the women who had come with him out of Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes, and on the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. Thankfully, this would not be the only encounter of the women present with Jesus' tomb. While now they are witnessing his burial before returning to prepare spices and perfumes to wrap the body in, soon they would come to be the first witnesses to his resurrection. For now he was laid in the tomb, but soon he would rise again, just as he had said he would, having defeated death, hell, sin, and the grave. So this brings us to the end of chapter 23. Next time we'll be examining the final chapter in the Gospel of Luke, containing Jesus' resurrection, appearing to the disciples, and even his ascension. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to stay up to date as we continue studying together. Thanks for watching.